Jake's life seemed perfect, until he discovered his wife, Marissa, had been hiding a series of affairs. As secrets unravel, Jake confronts Marissa, but the betrayal runs deeper than he ever imagined. With a dangerous stalker on the loose, Jake is forced to confront the man who shattered his marriage. Emotions collide as Jake navigates a maze of lies, deceit, and painful decisions. Will he find the closure he desperately needs? Or is this just the beginning of an even darker twist? Watch as Jake's world unravels in this gripping tale of love, betrayal, and redemption. Jake and Marissa were the kind of couple you'd envy at first glance. Jake, a 32-year-old software engineer, had an easygoing charm and a knack for making people laugh. Marissa, at 29, was an interior designer with a keen eye for detail and a passion for turning ordinary spaces into works of art. They lived in a cozy suburban neighborhood just outside of Denver, Colorado, with their golden retriever, Max. To everyone who knew them, they seemed like the perfect match, partners in life, love, and everything in between. Jake was a dependable guy, the type who'd drop everything to help a friend in need. His weekends were often spent tinkering in the garage or barbecuing in the backyard, where laughter from their friends and neighbors filled the air. Marissa, on the other hand, was the creative one. She had a talent for making their home warm and inviting, with handmade decor and a collection of plants that thrived under her care. Together, they painted the picture of a couple deeply in sync, but as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. They'd been married for 5 years, and like most relationships, theirs had its share of ups and downs. Lately, though, things had felt off. Jake noticed it first. Marissa had always been busy with her design projects, but in the past few months, her schedule seemed unusually packed. She was often out late meeting clients, and her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now glued to her side. Jake tried not to overthink it. He knew how passionate Marissa was about her work, and he didn't want to seem paranoid. Still, a nagging feeling lingered, a quiet voice in the back of his mind telling him that something wasn't right. It didn't help that their conversations had grown shorter, less personal. Marissa would brush off his questions about her day with vague answers, and her once bright enthusiasm for their time together seemed to have dimmed. One Friday evening, Jake decided to surprise Marissa by picking her up from work. She had mentioned a late meeting with a new client, and he thought it would be a sweet gesture to take her out for dinner afterward. He parked outside her studio and waited. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt began to creep in. The lights in her office were off, and there was no sign of Marissa's car. Jake called her, but it went straight to voicemail. Shrugging it off, he assumed she was still tied up with the client and decided to head home. On his way back, though, he spotted her car in the parking lot of a trendy downtown cafe. For a moment, relief washed over him. Maybe she had simply changed venues for the meeting. But as he pulled into the lot, his heart sank. Through the large glass windows of the cafe, he saw Marissa sitting at a table, laughing. Across from her was a man Jake didn't recognize. He was tall, well-dressed, and leaned in close as they talked. Jake's chest tightened. This wasn't a professional meeting. There was an unmistakable intimacy in the way they interacted. Jake debated confronting her right then and there, but something stopped him. Instead, he drove home, his mind racing. Had he been imagining things? Was there an innocent explanation? Or was this the confirmation of his worst fears? When Marissa finally came home later that night, she was her usual cheerful self, acting as if nothing was amiss. Jake didn't bring up what he'd seen, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. Over the next few weeks, he started paying closer attention to Marissa's behavior, looking for signs that might explain what was happening. It didn't take long for those signs to appear. There were late-night texts that she quickly dismissed as work-related. Her excuses for being out grew more elaborate, and her mood swings became harder to ignore. One evening, while she was in the shower, Jake found himself doing something he never thought he'd do. He checked her phone. His hands trembled as he scrolled through her messages, and what he found confirmed his suspicions. Marissa had been texting someone named Ethan. The messages weren't outright incriminating, but they were flirty. Inside jokes, emojis, and references to plans that didn't involve Jake. His heart sank as he realized this wasn't just paranoia. There was something going on, and it wasn't good. Jake decided to confront Marissa the next day. He rehearsed what he would say, trying to strike a balance between calm and firm. But when the moment came, it didn't go as planned. Marissa denied everything, insisting that Ethan was just a colleague and that Jake was overreacting. Her defensiveness only fueled his doubts, and their conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument. For days afterward, the tension in their home was palpable. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Marissa was hiding something, and Marissa seemed distant, avoiding eye contact and retreating to her studio for hours on end. Their once happy marriage was unraveling, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Then, one evening, Jake came home to find Marissa's laptop open on the dining table. She had stepped out for a moment, and curiosity got the better of him. What he saw on the screen confirmed everything he feared. A string of emails between Marissa and Ethan, filled with flirtatious exchanges and plans to meet up. Jake's hands clenched into fists as he read the words, his mind spinning with betrayal and anger. When Marissa walked in a few minutes later, Jake was waiting. Her face turned pale when she saw the laptop in his hands. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Marissa stammered, searching for an excuse, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Jake demanded to know how long it had been going on, but Marissa refused to answer, breaking down into tears instead. Jake, overwhelmed with emotion, walked out of the house, needing space to process what had just happened. Alone in his car, Jake's mind raced with questions. How had they gotten to this point? Could their marriage be salvaged? Or was this the end? One thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Jake spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and frustration. His mind replayed the confrontation with Marissa over and over again. Every look, every word, every tear. It was all burned into his memory. For years, he had trusted her implicitly, never doubting her loyalty. Now, every little thing she did seemed suspicious. Every moment they had shared tainted by her betrayal. But Jake wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. They had built a life together, and part of him wanted to believe that they could somehow salvage it. So after a sleepless night of staring at the ceiling, he made a decision. He would confront Marissa again, but this time, with a clear head. He needed answers, closure, and some sort of path forward, whether that meant rebuilding their relationship or walking away for good. When Jake approached Marissa that evening, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. He took a deep breath and sat down across from her. "We need to talk," he said firmly. Marissa hesitated but nodded, setting her phone down. "Okay," she replied softly, her voice barely audible. Jake started slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I found those emails, Marissa. I know there's more to this than you've admitted. I just need the truth. How long has this been going on?" Marissa looked down, her hands fidgeting nervously. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "It started a few months ago. At first, it was just texts. Harmless, I thought. But then we started meeting for coffee and it escalated." Her voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake. I swear I never wanted to hurt you." Jake's jaw tightened as he processed her words. "Why, Marissa? Why Ethan? Was I not enough for you? Were you unhappy?" Marissa wiped her eyes, struggling to find the right words. "It wasn't about you, Jake. It was me I've been feeling. Lost, like I don't know who I am anymore. Ethan. He made me feel alive, like I mattered. But I see now how selfish and wrong I was. I made a horrible mistake. Jake's anger flared at her explanation. So, what, you used him to fill some void instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things between us? Do you even understand what you've done? Marissa broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. And for a moment, Jake felt his resolve waver. He wanted to comfort her, to forgive her. But the pain of betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Instead, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and regret. Over the next week, the atmosphere in their home was suffocating. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was tense and awkward. Jake threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the chaos of his personal life, while Marissa seemed to retreat further into herself. It was clear that things couldn't continue like this, but neither of them knew how to move forward. One night, Jake's friend Chris invited him out for drinks. Chris had been his best friend since college, the kind of guy who could always be counted on to tell it like it was. As they sat at the bar nursing their beers, Jake finally opened up about what had been going on. "I just don't know what to do, man," Jake admitted. "Part of me wants to try to work things out, but another part of me can't even look at her without feeling sick." Chris nodded, listening intently. "Look, Jake, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's your call. But I will say this. If you're going to try to fix things, you both need to be all in. No half measures, no secrets. And if you can't do that, well, maybe it's time to walk away." Jake sighed, the weight of Chris's words sinking in. He knew his friend was right. Whatever decision he made, it needed to be decisive. The next morning, Jake suggested they attend couples therapy. To his surprise, Marissa agreed without hesitation. It was a small glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Their first session was awkward, with both of them struggling to express their feelings. But over time, they began to open up, revealing the cracks in their relationship that had gone unnoticed for so long. Marissa admitted to feeling neglected, not because Jake didn't care, but because he often got caught up in work and other obligations. Jake, in turn, confessed that he had been taking their relationship for granted, assuming that everything was fine without really checking in with her. It was painful, but it was also the first honest conversation they'd had in months. As they continued therapy, things slowly began to improve. Jake could see that Marissa was making an effort to rebuild his trust, and he tried to meet her halfway. They started spending more time together, going on dates and reconnecting over shared hobbies. For a while, it seemed like they might actually make it through this. But just as things were starting to look up, Jake received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Marissa and Ethan, taken just a few days earlier. They were sitting in a park, laughing and looking far too comfortable with each other. Along with the photo came a message. "She's still seeing him, thought you should know." Jake's world came crashing down all over again. He felt like a fool for believing that things could change, that Marissa could change. This time, there was no confrontation, no argument. Jake quietly packed a bag, left a note on the kitchen counter, and walked out the door. Jake sat in his car, staring at the note he'd hastily scribbled and left on the kitchen counter just hours earlier. It was a simple, gut-wrenching message. "I can't do this anymore. I need time to think. Please don't contact me." The weight of the words felt like a boulder crushing his chest, but he couldn't see another way forward. He had driven aimlessly for hours, his mind swirling with thoughts of betrayal and heartbreak. The photo of Marissa and Ethan wouldn't leave his mind. It was seared into his memory like a cruel reminder of everything he was trying to escape. For Jake, this wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was the collapse of the life he thought he had built. Jake eventually checked into a modest motel on the outskirts of town. The room was basic, barely more than a bed, a desk, and a television. But it was exactly what he needed. He wasn't ready to face the world or anyone in it, especially not Marissa. He turned off his phone and sank onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as exhaustion finally overtook him. When Jake woke the next morning, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, the constant noise in his head had quieted down, if only a little. He knew he couldn't hide forever, but he also knew that returning home wasn't an option. Not yet, anyway. He needed answers, and he needed them on his terms. Later that day, Jake made a call to a private investigator. It was a drastic step, one he never imagined he'd take, but desperation had pushed him to this point. He needed to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, assured him that she'd uncover the facts quickly. Jake gave her all the details he could about Marissa and Ethan, then braced himself for what was to come. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into work, trying to distract himself from the growing anxiety in his chest. He couldn't stop wondering what Rachel might uncover. Was Marissa still seeing Ethan? Were there others? The uncertainty was unbearable, but he forced himself to stay patient. When Rachel finally called, Jake's heart was pounding before he even picked up the phone. Her voice was calm, but direct. "Jake, I've got some information for you. It's not pretty, but I think you deserve to know." Rachel explained that Marissa had indeed continued seeing Ethan, but that wasn't the whole story. She had also been meeting with another man. A co-worker from her design firm. Rachel provided photos and documentation, each piece of evidence cutting Jake deeper than the last. The betrayal was worse than he'd imagined, and it left him reeling. Armed with this new information, Jake knew he couldn't keep running. He had to confront Marissa, to lay everything out on the table and finally put an end to the lies. It was a decision that filled him with equal parts dread and determination. But there was no turning back now. When Jake returned home, the house was eerily quiet. Marissa's car was in the driveway, but she didn't come out to greet him. As he stepped inside, he saw her sitting at the dining table, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked up at him, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other in silence. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling. "I didn't know if you were coming back." "I'm not here to stay," Jake said bluntly, his tone colder than he intended. He placed the photos and documents Rachel had given him on the table. "I think you owe me an explanation." Marissa's eyes widened as she looked at the evidence in front of her. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the photos, her face crumpling with guilt. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" Jake snapped, his anger finally boiling over. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with Ethan and God knows who else. And you didn't want to hurt me. Marissa, do you even hear yourself?" Marissa broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I don't know why I did it," she cried. "I was selfish, and I didn't think about how it would affect you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm so sorry, Jake. I really am." Jake shook his head, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. "Sorry isn't enough, Marissa. Not this time. You've destroyed everything we had, everything we built together. I don't even know who you are anymore." Marissa looked up at him, her tear-streaked face filled with despair. "I love you, Jake," she whispered. "I know I've ruined everything, but I still love you. Can't we try to fix this, please?" Jake's heart ached at her words, but he couldn't bring himself to trust her anymore. The betrayal had cut too deep, and he knew that no amount of therapy or apologies could erase what had happened. "I don't think I can," he said quietly. "I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again." The conversation ended with no resolution, no closure, just two broken people sitting across from each other, drowning in the wreckage of their relationship. Jake packed a few more belongings and left the house, this time for good. As he drove away, he felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. He had finally made his decision, but the pain of letting go was almost unbearable. Jake had officially stepped into uncharted territory. For days after leaving Marissa, he tried to distract himself. Long drives, mindless TV, even considering adopting another dog to keep Max company. But no matter what he did, his mind always drifted back to her betrayal. Every smile she'd given him, every promise of forever. It all felt like a cruel joke now. One evening, Jake found himself staring at his phone, debating whether to call Chris. He hadn't shared the full extent of what had happened since uncovering the second layer of Marissa's lies, but he knew he couldn't keep bottling it up. When Chris answered, Jake spilled everything: Rachel's investigation, the photos, the gut-wrenching conversation with Marissa. "Man, you've been through the ringer," Chris said after a long pause. "I don't even know what to say. Do you think she really wants to fix things, or is she just trying to save face?" Jake sighed. "I honestly don't know. Part of me thinks she's genuinely sorry, but another part of me can't shake the feeling that she's only sorry she got caught." Chris stayed silent for a moment before offering a suggestion. "Look, maybe you need to confront Ethan. If he's still in the picture, you deserve to hear his side of things. It might not give you closure, but at least you'll have the full story." The thought hadn't crossed Jake's mind before, but now it stuck. Confronting Ethan wasn't exactly appealing, but Chris was right. He couldn't keep circling the same unanswered questions. He needed clarity, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, Jake reached out to Rachel again, asking for any additional details she might have about Ethan. Within hours, she provided an address and a short dossier on him. Ethan wasn't just a co-worker. He was someone Marissa had worked closely with for years. They had been collaborating on major design projects, which meant they'd spent countless hours together. Jake felt his stomach churn as he imagined all the moments they might have shared. Moments he'd been oblivious to. When Jake pulled up to Ethan's apartment complex that evening, his hands were shaking. He had no idea what he was going to say or how Ethan would react, but he was past the point of caring. He knocked on the door, and after a few tense moments, it opened. Ethan stood there, clearly surprised to see Jake. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his tone cautious. Jake wasted no time. "We need to talk about Marissa." Ethan's face paled, and he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble." Jake crossed his arms, his voice steady but cold. "I'm not here to fight. I just want the truth. How long has this been going on between you and my wife?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed and leaned against the wall. "It started about 6 months ago. We worked late one night, had a few drinks, and one thing led to another. It wasn't supposed to happen again, but it did." Jake clenched his fists, struggling to keep his composure. "Why didn't you stop? Did you ever think about what you were doing to me to her?" Ethan looked genuinely remorseful, though it did little to soften Jake's anger. "I know it was wrong. I knew it the whole time. But Marissa, she said things weren't good between you two. She made it sound like she was unhappy, like you didn't care about her anymore." Jake's blood boiled at Ethan's words. It was one thing for Marissa to cheat, but to twist the truth about their marriage was a new level of betrayal. "You're telling me you justified sleeping with a married woman because she fed you some sob story? That's pathetic." Ethan hung his head, unable to meet Jake's gaze. "You're right. It was selfish and I regret it. But for what it's worth, it's over. She called it off weeks ago." Jake's heart sank. The timing lined up with their first therapy session, which meant Marissa had been trying to end things, while lying about the full extent of her infidelity. He shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done enough damage. Stay away from her." Jake turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there in silence. As he drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation hadn't brought him the closure he'd hoped for. Instead, it left him with more questions and a deeper sense of betrayal. When Jake arrived back at his motel, he found a message waiting for him from Rachel. It was a single photo, Marissa sitting alone in a cafe, staring out the window with a forlorn expression. The caption read, "She's been here for hours." Jake stared at the photo, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and lingering affection. He knew he needed to confront Marissa one last time, to lay everything on the line and decide, once and for all, whether there was anything left to salvage. The next day, Jake texted Marissa, asking to meet. Her response was immediate and full of relief. They agreed to meet at a park they used to visit when they first started dating. A place filled with happy memories, now tinged with sorrow. When Jake arrived, Marissa was already there, sitting on a bench with Max by her side. She looked up as he approached, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavy in the air. "I didn't think you'd come," Marissa said quietly. Jake sat down beside her, keeping a careful distance. "We need to talk, Marissa. I've heard everything. From Ethan, from Rachel. I know about the lies, the excuses, everything. What I don't know is why." Marissa took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "Jake, I don't have an excuse. I messed up. Horribly. I let my insecurities and my selfishness ruin the best thing I've ever had, and I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you to give me one. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I can change." Jake looked at her, his heart aching. He wanted to believe her, to trust her, but the scars she'd left were still fresh. "Marissa, I loved you with everything I had, but you didn't just betray me. You betrayed us. You shattered the life we built together, and I don't know if I can ever put those pieces back together." Tears streamed down Marissa's face as she reached for his hand. "Please, Jake, don't give up on us. I know I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." Jake pulled his hand away, standing up. "I don't know if I can. Marissa, maybe time will change things, but right now, I need space. I need to figure out who I am without you." Marissa nodded, her sobs quieting as she accepted his words. "I understand," she whispered. "I'll wait for you, Jake, no matter how long it takes." As Jake walked away, Max trotting beside him, he felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, grief, anger, and a glimmer of hope for the future. For the first time in months, he felt like he was taking control of his life again, even if it meant walking away from the person he once thought he'd spend forever with. As the days turned into weeks, Jake began to settle into his new life, one free from the emotional roller coaster of his marriage. He moved into a small rental home on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where he could focus on rebuilding himself. Max, ever the loyal companion, was his constant source of comfort, offering a sense of stability in an otherwise chaotic time. But peace was fleeting. One evening, as Jake was reviewing paperwork for his new job, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, and the message sent a chill down his spine. "You think you know the full story, but you don't meet me at the Lantern Cafe tomorrow at 7 p.m. if you want the truth." Jake stared at the message, his mind racing. Who could this be? And what truth were they talking about? He debated ignoring it, but curiosity and a nagging sense of unfinished business got the better of him. The next evening, Jake found himself at the Lantern Cafe, nervously scanning the room for his mysterious contact. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit, approached Jake's table. "Jake Warren?" he asked, his tone measured. When Jake nodded, the man sat down and introduced himself. "My name is Patrick. I'm Ethan's former business partner, and Marissa's former client." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. Former client. What does this have to do with me? Patrick leaned in, lowering his voice. A lot more than you realize. I came to you because you deserve to know what you're dealing with. Ethan isn't the only person Marissa betrayed you with. There's a pattern here. One that's been going on for years. Jake's stomach turned as Patrick began to recount his story. He explained how Marissa had been hired to redesign Patrick's office space 2 years earlier. During the project, she and Patrick developed a friendship that eventually turned into something more. It was brief, Patrick admitted, and he ended it when he realized she was married. But the damage had been done. It's not just me, Jake, Patrick continued. She's had other connections. If you will, Ethan was just the latest. I know this is a lot to take in, but I thought you should know. Jake sat in stunned silence, the weight of Patrick's words pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. The idea that Marissa's betrayal went even deeper than he'd thought was almost too much to bear. But as painful as it was, he also felt a strange sense of validation. His instincts hadn't been wrong. There was always more to the story. Why are you telling me this now? Jake finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. Patrick sighed. Because I saw how you confronted Ethan. Word travels fast in our circles, and I thought you should have the full picture. You deserve better than this, Jake. Jake nodded, barely able to process what he'd just heard. Thanks. I guess, he muttered, though gratitude was the last thing he felt. After Patrick left, Jake sat alone at the cafe for a long time, his mind replaying everything he'd just learned. He thought back to his time with Marissa, trying to piece together the moments he might have missed, the signs he might have ignored. It was like watching his life unravel in reverse. The next day, Jake decided it was time to confront Marissa one final time. This wasn't about reconciliation or closure. It was about getting the truth, no matter how much it hurt. He called her and asked to meet at the house they once shared, now a hollow shell of what it used to be. When Jake arrived, Marissa was waiting for him, her face pale and drawn. I didn't think I'd see you again, she said quietly. Neither did I, Jake replied, stepping inside. But there's more I need to know, and I'm done with half-truths and excuses. Patrick told me everything. Marissa. About him, about the others. Is it true? Marissa's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment Jake thought she might deny it. But then she broke down, tears streaming down her face as she nodded. It's true, she whispered. All of it. I don't know why I did those things, Jake. I wish I could give you an answer, but I can't. Jake's anger bubbled to the surface, his voice rising. You can't, Marissa. You've been lying to me for years. You've destroyed everything we had. And for what, a series of meaningless affairs? Marissa sobbed harder, collapsing onto the couch. I'm broken, Jake. I've been broken for a long time, and I didn't know how to fix it. I thought these distractions would make me feel whole, but they only made things worse. Jake stared at her, his emotions a chaotic storm of rage, sadness, and pity. For years, he had loved this woman, trusted her, and built a life with her, only to discover that it had all been a lie. And yet, as much as he hated what she had done, a small part of him still cared about her, still wanted to understand. Marissa, he said, his voice softer now. You need help. Real help. I can't be the one to give it to you. But you need to figure out why you keep doing this, to yourself and to the people who care about you. Marissa nodded, her sobs quieting. I know, she whispered. I've started seeing a therapist. I'm trying, Jake. I really am. Jake stood, his decision made. I hope you find the answers you're looking for. But I can't be part of this anymore. I deserve better. And so do you. As he walked out the door for the last time, Jake felt a strange sense of relief. The chapter with Marissa was finally closing, and while the pain of betrayal would linger, he knew he was stronger for having faced it head-on. Jake walked away from the house, but the weight of the confrontation lingered. Every step felt heavy, like he was trudging through thick mud, unable to escape the emotional gravity of the situation. He knew the end of his relationship with Marissa was inevitable, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. For the first time in weeks, Jake allowed himself to truly process everything. Her betrayals, the lies, the years they had spent together that now felt tainted. As he drove back to his rental house, his mind raced with questions. How had he missed the signs? Could he have done something differently? Was any of this his fault? Later that evening, Jake sat on his couch with Max curled up beside him. He flipped through old photos on his phone, pictures of him and Marissa on vacations, at family gatherings, laughing and smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of him that no longer existed. Then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Rachel, the private investigator. Jake hesitated before answering. "Rachel, what's going on?" he asked, his voice weary. "There's something you need to know," Rachel said, her tone serious. "I didn't want to bother you after everything, but I've been digging a little deeper into Ethan turns out. He's not exactly who he seems." Jake frowned, sitting up straighter. "What do you mean?" "Ethan has a history," Rachel explained. "He's been involved in multiple workplace affairs, and in at least 2 cases, they ended with serious consequences. One woman filed a harassment claim against him, and another left the company after her husband found out Ethan seems to have a pattern of targeting married women." Jake's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information. The betrayal stung even more now, knowing that Marissa had been swept into the orbit of someone who thrived on breaking relationships. But there was also a part of Jake that felt oddly vindicated. This wasn't just about Marissa's flaws. Ethan had played a role in manipulating the situation. "Thanks, Rachel," Jake said after a moment. "I appreciate you telling me." "You're welcome," Rachel replied. "If you need anything else, just let me know. And Jake, don't let this define you. You deserve better." After the call ended, Jake sat in silence, processing what he had just learned. He knew confronting Ethan again would be pointless. There was nothing to gain from engaging with someone like him. Instead, Jake resolved to focus on his own healing, to move forward and rebuild his life without the shadows of Marissa and Ethan looming over him. But life had other plans. The very next day, Jake received an unexpected email from Marissa. It wasn't an apology or a plea for reconciliation, but something entirely different, a warning. "Jake," the email began, "I think you need to be careful. Ethan has been acting strange lately. He's been calling me non-stop, showing up at my office, and refusing to take no for an answer. I'm scared he might do something reckless." Jake's first reaction was disbelief. After everything, now Ethan was harassing Marissa. The thought filled him with equal parts anger and concern. As much as he wanted to wash his hands of the entire situation, he couldn't ignore the possibility that Marissa might be in danger. That evening, Jake found himself pacing his living room, debating whether to call Marissa. He knew their relationship was beyond repair, but the idea of her being harassed or threatened by Ethan didn't sit right with him. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed her number. "Jake?" Marissa answered, her voice shaky. "What's going on with Ethan?" Jake asked, cutting straight to the point. Marissa sighed heavily. "He's been relentless. I told him it's over, but he won't let go. He's been sending me flowers, leaving notes on my car, and even showed up at my apartment last night. I didn't know who else to tell." Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him. "Have you called the police?" "I haven't yet," Marissa admitted. "I was hoping he'd stop on his own, but it's only getting worse." Jake sighed, his protective instincts kicking in despite everything that had happened between them. You need to report this. Marissa stalkers don't just stop because you want them to. You need to take this seriously. Marissa hesitated but eventually agreed. You're right. I'll call them tomorrow. The next few days were a blur of tension and unease. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was going to happen. He checked in with Marissa periodically, despite his own reservations, just to make sure she was okay. Each time, she assured him that she was handling the situation and that the police had been notified. But then, one night, Jake's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a frantic voice greeted him on the other end. Jake, it's Marissa's neighbor. You need to come to her place right now. There's been an incident. Jake's heart dropped. Without asking for details, he grabbed his keys and rushed out the door, Max barking anxiously as he left. When he arrived at Marissa's apartment complex, the scene was chaotic. Police cars and an ambulance were parked outside, their lights flashing brightly against the dark night. Jake pushed through the crowd of onlookers, his chest tight with fear. He spotted Marissa sitting on the curb, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked shaken but unharmed. Relief flooded through him as he knelt beside her. Marissa, what happened? He asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan, she whispered. He broke into my apartment. He was yelling, accusing me of ruining his life. I thought he was going to hurt me. Jake felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. Are you okay? He didn't get the chance, Marissa interrupted, her voice trembling. The police showed up just in time. Someone must have called them when they heard the commotion. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. You're safe now, he said firmly, though the adrenaline coursing through his veins made it hard to believe his own words. As the police took Ethan into custody, Jake stayed by Marissa's side, offering what little comfort he could. It was a strange, bittersweet moment. Despite everything, he couldn't help but feel responsible for her safety, but he also knew that this was the final chapter in their story. As the police lights faded into the night, Jake and Marissa sat in silence on the curb outside her apartment. The gravity of what had just happened hung in the air like a storm cloud. Despite the whirlwind of emotions, one thing was clear. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Jake turned to Marissa, his expression unreadable. Marissa, this could have ended so much worse. Why didn't you tell me sooner how serious things were with Ethan? Marissa looked down, her hands twisting the edges of the blanket wrapped around her. I didn't want to bother you after everything I put you through. I didn't think I had the right to ask for your help. Jake sighed, the weight of her words cutting deep. Marissa, I'm not saying we can fix what's broken between us. But you need to understand, this was never just about you. When you're in trouble, you can't handle it alone, especially not with someone like him. Marissa nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I know I see that now. The tension between them lingered, unresolved but undeniable. Jake wanted to say more, to dig deeper into everything they had left unsaid, but the exhaustion of the night was catching up with him. I think we've both had enough for one night, he said finally. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Marissa hesitated before answering. I can call my sister, she'll let me stay with her. Jake nodded, standing up and offering her a hand. Good. Let me know when you've settled in. As Marissa disappeared into her apartment to pack, Jake leaned against his car, his mind racing. The events of the past few months had tested him in ways he never thought possible, but tonight felt like the breaking point. He couldn't help but wonder if this was the closure he'd been searching for, or just the beginning of a new chapter in their tangled story. The next morning, Jake woke up to a string of messages from Marissa, each one more apologetic than the last. She thanked him for being there, despite everything, and assured him that she was staying with her sister in a safe, secure place, Jake responded with a simple, "Take care of yourself," unsure of how to navigate their new dynamic. For the next few days, Jake tried to refocus on his own life. He threw himself into work, spent hours walking Max through the quiet trails near his house, and even started reconnecting with old friends. But no matter how much he tried to move forward, Marissa's voice lingered in his mind, her pleas for help, her tears, her whispered apologies. They all felt like echoes of a life he was struggling to leave behind. Then came another unexpected twist. Jake was at his office, preparing for a client meeting, when his phone buzzed with a call from Rachel. "Jake, I hate to bother you again, but I thought you'd want to know. Ethan made bail." Jake froze, his heart sinking. "What? How is that even possible?" "It's not uncommon," Rachel explained. "But here's the thing. He's already been spotted near Marissa's sister's house. I thought you'd want to know so you can warn her." Jake's blood ran cold. The thought of Ethan stalking Marissa again sent a surge of protectiveness through him, despite everything that had happened between them. He thanked Rachel and immediately called Marissa, his voice urgent. "Marissa, listen to me. Ethan's out on bail, and Rachel says he's been seen near your sister's place. You need to stay somewhere else. Now." Marissa's voice wavered with fear. "Oh my God. Jake, I don't know what to do." "Pack your things and leave," Jake said firmly. "Go to a hotel, anywhere. Just get somewhere safe. I'll help you figure out the rest later." Marissa agreed, her voice trembling, and Jake hung up, his mind racing. He knew she needed more than just a safe place to stay. She needed protection, and the police weren't moving fast enough. Against his better judgment, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. That evening, Jake drove to Marissa's sister's house to make sure she had gotten out safely. As he pulled up, he saw a figure lingering near the edge of the property. Even in the dim light, Jake recognized him. It was Ethan. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel as adrenaline surged through him. He stepped out of the car, his heart pounding. "Ethan!" he called, his voice cutting through the night. Ethan turned, his expression shifting from surprise to defiance. "Jake, I figured you'd show up eventually." Jake took a step closer, keeping his voice steady despite the anger boiling inside him. "What the hell are you doing here? Leave Marissa alone. You've done enough damage," Ethan sneered, taking a step forward. "You think you're some kind of hero? Marissa made her choices? Don't blame me for her mistakes." Jake's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This isn't about blame, it's about you, not understanding when to walk away. Marissa doesn't want you in her life. You need to accept that." Ethan laughed bitterly, his voice laced with venom. "And you think she wants you? You're just the safe option, Jake, the fallback. She'll never love you the way you want her to." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut, but he refused to let Ethan see how much they hurt. "Say whatever you want about me," he said, his voice firm. "But stay away from her. This is your last warning." Ethan stepped closer, his posture aggressive. For a moment, Jake thought he might lunge, but the sound of sirens in the distance froze them both. Someone had called the police. Ethan's expression shifted to panic, and he backed away. "This isn't over," he muttered, before disappearing into the shadows. When the police arrived, Jake explained the situation and provided Rachel's evidence of Ethan's stalking behavior. The officers assured him they would take immediate action, but Jake knew the fight wasn't over. Ethan's obsession ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, and it would take more than legal action to put an end to it. Later that night, Jake sat alone in his living room, Max curled up at his feet. The confrontation with Ethan had left him shaken, but it also solidified something within him. A sense of purpose, a determination to protect the people he cared about, even if it meant stepping back into the chaos he had tried so hard to escape. As he stared out the window into the quiet night, Jake realized that this wasn't just about Marissa anymore. It was about reclaiming his life. finding strength in the face of adversity, and learning to let go of the things he couldn't control. Jake leaned back on his couch, his thoughts drifting over the whirlwind of events that had turned his life upside down. The confrontation with Ethan felt like the last major storm to weather, and now that it had passed, Jake could finally feel the weight beginning to lift. It wasn't easy, far from it. But for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. The police, armed with the evidence provided by Rachel and Jake's account of Ethan's behavior, acted swiftly. Ethan was arrested for violating the restraining order Marissa had filed earlier in the week. Jake later learned that Ethan's prior harassment claims had caught up to him, and this latest incident was the nail in the coffin. He would face charges, likely losing his job and any credibility he once had. For Jake, knowing that Ethan was out of the picture brought relief, but it didn't erase the scars of the past few months. The damage done to his trust, his marriage, and his sense of self was something he knew would take time to heal. Still, he was determined not to let the experience define him. In the days following Ethan's arrest, Jake and Marissa had one final conversation. She reached out, asking to meet in a public park, a neutral ground where they could talk without the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. When Jake arrived, Marissa was already sitting on a bench, staring out at the lake. She turned as he approached, offering a small, hesitant smile. "Thanks for coming," she said softly. Jake nodded, sitting down beside her but maintaining some distance. "What did you want to talk about?" he asked, his tone calm but guarded. Marissa took a deep breath, clearly gathering her thoughts. "I wanted to say thank you," she began, "for everything you've done. You didn't have to help me after everything I put you through, but you did, and I'll never forget that." Jake shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I didn't do it for you," he admitted. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be treated the way Ethan treated you, no matter what's happened in the past." Marissa nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know I've hurt you, Jake, more than I can ever make up for, and I don't expect your forgiveness. But I hope you can find peace." Jake looked at her, his expression softening. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you," he said honestly. "But I've learned a lot through all of this about myself, about what I deserve in a relationship, and about what I want for my future. I think we both need to move on." Marissa smiled through her tears, a bittersweet expression that spoke volumes. "I think you're right," she said. "I'm working on myself, Jake. I've been seeing a therapist regularly, and I'm trying to understand why I made the choices I did. I don't want to hurt anyone like this ever again." Jake gave her a small nod, feeling a flicker of hope, not for their relationship, but for her as a person. "Good," he said simply. "I hope you find what you're looking for." They sat in silence for a few moments, watching the ducks glide across the lake. Finally, Jake stood, signaling that it was time to go. "Take care of yourself, Marissa," he said, his voice filled with quiet finality. "You too, Jake," she replied, her tone soft but sincere. In the weeks that followed, Jake found himself embracing the fresh start he'd long resisted. He poured his energy into his work, earning recognition for his dedication and landing a promotion that came with more stability and creative freedom. On weekends, he explored hiking trails with Max, savoring the peace and solitude of nature. He also reconnected with his family and friends, who had been his anchor throughout the ordeal. Chris, ever the pragmatic friend, gave him a hard time for putting up with so much drama, but Jake knew it was Chris's way of showing he cared. The time spent with loved ones reminded Jake of what truly mattered: relationships built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. Jake also started to open his heart to the possibility of new beginnings. He wasn't actively seeking a relationship, but he wasn't closed off to the idea either. For now, He was content focusing on himself, learning to love the man he was becoming. As the months rolled by, Jake reflected on the lessons he had learned. Betrayal, as painful as it was, had taught him the value of boundaries and the importance of self-worth. He realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving someone else of their wrongdoing. It was about freeing himself from the weight of anger and resentment. Marissa, he learned through mutual acquaintances, was continuing her journey of self-improvement. She had moved to a different city, started a new job, and seemed genuinely committed to rebuilding her life. Jake wished her well, knowing that their paths had diverged for a reason. One crisp autumn evening, Jake found himself sitting on his porch, a warm cup of coffee in hand and Max curled up at his feet. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake felt at peace. He didn't have all the answers, but he had something even more important, a sense of clarity about who he was and what he wanted. Life, he realized, wasn't about avoiding pain, but about finding the strength to rise above it, to grow and thrive despite the challenges. Jake leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched the stars begin to twinkle in the evening sky. He had been through hell and back, but he had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. And that's where Jake's journey ends for now, on a note of hope, healing, and the promise of brighter days ahead. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more captivating tales like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps us bring more incredible stories to life.